It's a real delight to have John Delano with us today. He has served on more than 20 scientific advisory panels for NASA and the National Science Foundation. He is the author of 70 articles in professional scientific journals dealing with chemical analysis of Apollo lunar samples. John retired as a professor at the distinguished rank from the University at Albany in late 2016. He now resides in Williamsburg, Virginia, where he continues to publish new research. Thank you, John, for being with us today.
Thank you, Gloria. It's really a pleasure to be here at GMALL. It's always a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me to be here. Welcome, everybody. I hope you enjoyed today's talk dealing with NASA's Artemis program, America's ambitious return to the moon. As we all know, Apollo was a very ambitious program for NASA and the United States in the 60s and 70s. As ambitious as Apollo was at that time, I think you will see that the Artemis program is comparably ambitious, even though we are multiple generations of technology beyond the Apollo days. So buckle up, we're in for a ride here. Apollo 17, Apollo was a great success. 6 landings on the moon, 12 Americans walked on the moon, but they stayed there for only a maximum of about 3 Earth days before they returned to Earth. So it was a brief visit to the moon for each of the 6 Apollo landings. That is not what Artemis is going to do. Artemis, we are going to stay. So the overview of NASA's Artemis program is the following. It's a multinational collaboration. Apollo was not. It involves our allies and also commercial partners, most notably SpaceX, as you will see. The goal of NASA's Artemis program is to construct 1 or more permanent multinational scientific research stations on the moon and to develop and test technologies for sustainable missions to Mars. So the moon is going to be a testing ground, a stepping stone for more ambitious human missions to Mars. We also have a scientific rationale for going there, and that is to better understand the distribution of valuable resources. And as you'll see, the moon has some valuable resources. And also then to understand the processes that shape the chemical evolution of planets. This is a mosaic of hundreds of very high-resolution images from NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. The resolution on each of these, on this entire image, is probably about 2 feet. So you could really zoom into this image and see things only about 2 feet across. So this is an image of the moon that is really quite spectacular. And it shows the landing sites for the 6 Apollo missions. And notice that, that they went to areas not far from the equator. The equator goes horizontally across from east to west here. So you can see that 11, 12, and 14 were close to the equator. 15, 16, and 17 were quite a ways away from the moon's equator. That's where we went for Apollo, and each of those missions had specific scientific and engineering reasons to land at those specific sites. There was nothing random about any of those sites. Each one had been carefully selected by scientists and engineers as to where the astronauts would go. Artemis is not going there. Artemis is going to the south polar region of the moon, as shown at the tip of the red arrow at the bottom of the screen there. We're going to the south pole of the moon, and you should probably be tipping your heads like a dog hearing a strange sound. Oh, why would you go to the south pole of the moon? The reason for that will become clear very quickly. The moon, although although as you look up at the moon, and as you look at this image here, the moon seems to be a pretty drab place. Different shades of gray, smooth, dark colored areas, which are young lava flows. By young, I mean about 3.5 billion years old. Those are young areas on the moon. The dark, smooth areas on the moon then are lava flows. The lighter colored regions that you see are very much beaten up, lots of craters, very few craters on the smooth, dark areas. That's because although the smooth, dark areas are lava flows that are only about 3.5 billion years old, the lighter colored regions of the moon that are highly beaten up are about 4.5 billion years old. And you can see that they've really been beaten up very badly by asteroids striking the moon over the last 4.5 billion years. If we had very sensitive eyes, this is what the moon would look like. These are not computer-generated false colors. This is an image of the moon showing that it is, in fact, quite a complex place. Each of those colors are chemically and mineralogically different. The blue areas and the red areas and the purple areas and the greenish orange areas, every color difference that you see in there is a reflection of differences in the chemical and mineralogical composition of the moon. You can see then that the moon is a geologically complex place, far more complex than we might have otherwise thought by simply looking up at the moon and seeing these different shades of gray. The Artemis program is going to be relying on two principal rocket systems. And here this slide shows the space shuttle on the left here, just for scale. The Falcon Heavy, SpaceX Falcon Heavy, that is doing a beautiful job. SpaceX has invented an astonishing technology for reusability. The NASA's Space Launch System, SLS for Space Launch System. This is the rocket that you will see shortly a video of during its first launch. This is going to be the workhorse for NASA to get astronauts to lunar orbit from Earth. The Saturn V, for scale here, about 363 feet tall. This was the rocket, of course, that was invented for the Apollo program. And until last year, Apollo Saturn V rocket was the biggest, most powerful rocket that was ever successfully flown by human beings. And it had that title for more than 50 years. It kept that for more than 50 years. Says something about the technology that the United States was able to put together in the 60s to make sure that that was the most powerful rocket in the world for more than 50 years. SpaceX Starship, notice, is a gargantuan spacecraft, 394 feet tall, and has double the thrust, 2 times the thrust of NASA's new SLS rocket, double. This is not an incrementally larger rocket. It is in a class by itself. SpaceX Starship. So here is the SLS, the first SLS that was launched by NASA in November of last year. Consists of 2 solid fuel rocket boosters on the side here. Those are the largest solid rocket boosters ever built by human beings. And the 2-stage rocket central core of the rocket, and the Orion spacecraft where the astronauts ride the rocket. Here is a video showing from three different perspectives. The launch of the SLS back in November of 2022. Two solid rocket boosters shown here on the left, and the four engines at the base here, which are fired by hydrogen, oxygen, liquid oxygen fueled engines. So here we go. You will also see an enormous amount of water spraying across the launch pad here, and that is intended to cut the sound of the rockets to keep it from damaging the launch pad. So here we go.
And here we go.
10.
Hydrogen burn-off igniters initiated. 7, 6, 5. 4-stage engine start. 3, 2, 1. Boosters in ignition. And liftoff of Artemis 1. 2, 1. Boosters in ignition. And liftoff of Artemis 1. We rise together. 6, 5. 4-stage engine start. 3, 2, 1. Boosters in ignition. And liftoff of Artemis 1. 3, 2, 1. Boosters in ignition. And liftoff of Artemis 1. We rise together.
It's a gargantuan rocket, and I'd like to show you the launch as viewed from 4 miles away. Now, sound travels at about 1,100 feet a second. So it takes roughly 5 seconds for sound to travel 1 mile. If you're 4 miles away, the sound will take about 20 seconds to reach you. So here, right here, where I'm pointing, is the launch pad for the Space Launch System, that rocket, in November of 2022. It's lit up by spotlights there. And in a moment, from 4 miles away, you're going to see this area turn into daylight as that rocket lifts off the pad. And watch the reaction of the spectators here. We are at T-minus 7 seconds and counting. Here we go. Sorry. Here comes the sound.
Let's go!
There's the moon in the upper right corner of the screen there. If you ever have a chance to go to Cape Canaveral to watch one of these large rockets blast off, I would encourage you to do it. I personally watched the last Apollo mission blast off for the moon. It was a nighttime launch like that one was. And I can tell you, and I'm going to exaggerate only just a little bit, but when it was lifting off, I was 7 miles away. When the sound eventually got to you, the buffeting on your chest was like this, as your voice was just trembling just from the pounding of the sound over your chest. It was wow. What a trip, I'm telling you. Anyway, here is the Orion spacecraft, which will carry 4 astronauts. And here it is in comparison, notice around 37 tons. A crew of 4. This is the Orion capsule that will be launched by the NASA's SLS rocket. And here is the Apollo command module for scale. So notice that it's quite a bit bigger. It had a crew of 3, 30 tons versus 37 tons. So an Apollo on steroids. The first Artemis mission, which flew in November, did not have humans on board. It was a test flight. It went out to the moon, went into orbit around the moon, tested out the systems, and then came back. And it was a highly successful flight. It lasted for about 25 days, and the system worked like a champ. The next mission will be Artemis 2 next year. And here is an image taken from Artemis 1 spacecraft. This is a camera that was on the end of one of the solar panels. And you can see the moon here in the top and the Earth about 250,000 miles beyond the moon. So here is in the upper right corner there, you see the Earth and the moon as viewed from this camera on the Orion spacecraft during the Artemis 1 flight. You can see that this picture was taken from 269,000 miles from Earth at that time. Again, a beautiful flight, completely automated. The systems could not have worked better. However, as shown here, here is a graphic showing the various systems that will be needed for a fully operational Artemis program. And those systems that were tested during the Artemis 1 flight was the first column on the left with the yellow star is the rocket itself. It worked well. The second yellow star is the Orion spacecraft. That worked well. Gateway is going to be an orbital space station around the moon itself. That is still being designed. It hasn't been built yet, let alone tested. The science for the lunar surface, of course, we didn't land on Artemis 1, so science was not involved there. HLS, the human landing system, we did not land on the moon. For Artemis 1, that system is still being developed, so no yellow star there. Ground systems for monitoring the flight, they tested out well during Artemis 1, but notice that there are lots of other components here, 5 other major components of the Artemis program, which were not tested during Artemis 1. So there's still a lot of stuff yet to do to have a fully operational Artemis program. Artemis 2 will occur next year, late in the year, launch date not yet firmed, but it will involve 4 astronauts on a 10-day mission where they will launch from Cape Canaveral, loop around the moon in the Orion spacecraft, and return to Earth 10 days after launch. So this will be the first humans to ride a space launch system around the moon, and the first time that human beings will be near the moon will be the first time since 1972 with the end of the Apollo program with the Apollo 17 mission. So this is important, an important landmark timeline for the Artemis program. The crew will be these folks here. 3 are NASA astronauts: Christina Koch, Reed Wiseman, and Victor Glover. These are all veteran astronauts who have spent hundreds of days on space flights, particularly to the orbiting International Space Station. Christina holds the record for the longest stay of a woman in the International Space Station. She was on board for 386 days. Victor and Reed have also been on board for hundreds of days in the International Space Station. So these are all veteran astronauts. The other astronaut, Jeremy Hansen, is a Canadian astronaut who will be making his first space flight. This will be the crew then of Artemis 2. This is what the crew, this is a mock-up of the Orion, interior of the Orion spacecraft. And this is the seating arrangement of the astronauts in this Orion capsule. Compared to the Apollo command module, this is spacious. The control panel is right here in the upper left corner, being monitored by two of the astronauts. Very small, very compact, compared to the myriad of instruments and switches that were in the cramped Apollo command module. This is what the Apollo command module looked like for comparison. Here was the seat for the commander in the bottom left. The command module pilot sat here in the center seat, and the lunar module pilot sat here. And they had this array of instruments in their face through that mission. Notice, again, very different than what the Orion capsule has. How does SpaceX Starship fit in the grand scheme of things? SpaceX Starship is pivotal for the success of the Artemis program. In late 2026, it may go to 27. This is really up for grabs now, because there are several things that really have to happen between now and Artemis, the flight of Artemis 3. But Artemis 3 is going to be the first human landing on the moon since 1972. It will involve the SpaceX Starship. SLS will launch the crew of 4 to the moon, where it will rendezvous with a SpaceX Starship. They will transfer from the command module, the Orion ship, to the Starship. And the Starship will land on the south pole of the moon, as I'll show in a moment. However, the Starship needs to be shown to be successful in its launch before we put human beings on it. It will need to be in Earth orbit. Starship will launch into Earth orbit, and then will need to be refueled in Earth orbit by multiple SpaceX launches to refill the fuel on the Starship that will go to the moon. Has the refueling ever been done before? No. Have multiple launches over the course of a couple of days been done yet? No. Has the SpaceX Starship launched successfully yet? No. All of those things have to happen before Artemis 3 can happen. So there are multiple things that have yet to be demonstrated before Artemis 3. Notice only 2 years, about 2.5 years, maybe we'll be generous here, 3 years from now, all of those things have to be done, and be done reliably and with great confidence for Artemis 3 to become the first human landing on the moon in late 2026. Here is Starship. It is remarkable. It is an astonishing piece of engineering on the part of SpaceX. It is fully reusable. The Space Launch System built by NASA is not. everything is thrown away. I'll repeat that. SpaceX Starship is fully reusable. They are talking about multiple launches per day by the same rocket. The Space Launch System by NASA will have typically one flight every 2 years. It will cost somewhere in the vicinity of $3 to $4 billion per launch. The Government Accounting Office has suggested that in the long term, the Space Launch System may not be sustainable, may not be affordable by NASA in the long term. So stay tuned. SpaceX may turn out to be the full partner in the Artemis program in the future. But anyway, here we go. The SpaceX Starship had its first launch. Remember, it's nearly 400 feet tall, has double the thrust of the NASA's Space Launch System. It has 16 million pounds of thrust with a cluster of over 30 Raptor engines powered by liquid oxygen and methane. Has a 30-foot diameter. It is astonishing. This is what the bottom of the rocket looks like. Look at all those engines. These are engineering marvels. And to imagine that all of them will work flawlessly is in itself a technological marvel. They did not on the maiden flight. It is spacious. Compared to the Orion spacecraft, here are astronauts. I hope you can see where I'm pointing on the left side of the crew compartment of Starship. Here are 4 astronauts, just for scale. This is enormous. If SpaceX Starship is able to perform according to specs, it will be able to land 100 tons of usable equipment on the lunar surface with every flight. 100 tons of usable equipment per landing. It's in a class by itself. This is astonishing. Again, here shows the scale. Here is a Starship being mated to the Super Heavy booster here, and work personnel here at the SpaceX launch facility in Texas, just for scale. You can see the size of this piece of equipment. It is just in a class by itself. Let me point out also that although SpaceX is a private company, NASA has poured billions of dollars of seed money into SpaceX over the last several years. That has been designed by Congress to occur, and NASA has therefore had SpaceX as its partner and continues to have SpaceX as its partner. So this is not entirely built on private money. It is a private, governmental, public-private enterprise. SpaceX is and SpaceX has achieved an enormous brain trust of scientists and engineers who have been able to put this together with a lot of government funding, but without the government constraints. Here is the launch of SpaceX Starship. It was the maiden launch of SpaceX Starship on April 20 of this year. And watch this puppy go. Also, watch the debris fly. That flash that you just saw was an anomaly. That was not a good sign. 5 engines have already failed. With those 5 engines having failed, it cannot reach orbit. It is now spinning, it has been destabilized, and it is about to be destroyed. There it goes. It's a goner. So it had about 2 minutes. It had about 2 minutes of flight. This cloud of debris here is not rocket exhaust. It is the launch pad itself being torn apart. This is the launch pad after it left. It got damaged. So the debris that you saw flying through that cloud of debris were great chunks of concrete that had been torn up by the thrust of the Super Heavy booster. SpaceX has decided that, well, if you're going to have multiple launches a day, you can't have this happen on every launch. So they have cleverly come up with a water-cooled heavy metal plate to go underneath the launch platform that will be water-cooled and much stronger than the concrete that was initially here and thought to have been strong enough to withstand the thrust of takeoff from the SpaceX Starship. And when the second flight of Starship occurs, we'll see whether that massive water-cooled plate is able to prevent this kind of destruction underneath the launch pad. Also, the debris, you can see, impacted some of these tanks located away from the launch site. When Starship becomes operational, here is Starship and here is Super Heavy. This Super Heavy will return to the launch pad, be captured by the launch gantry, refueled. The Starship on future flights will return, land on top of it, be refueled, and then the entire package will be launched again. So everything here is reusable. Everything is reusable. Now, the Apollo spacecraft looked like this, the command ship and the lunar module. But again, the Apollo missions were, we go there, we visit for a day or 3, and then we go home. That is not going to be the case for Artemis. This is the plan for Artemis 3 and Artemis 4. Here's a Starship on the lunar surface on the south pole of the moon. And you can see at the bottom here, human beings for scale. They will ride an elevator. This is where the crew will be kept, up here in the top of Starship. And they will ride an elevator more than 100 feet down the exterior of Starship and get to the lunar surface. And they will unload from this cavernous region upwards of 100 tons of instruments and payload that will be installed on the lunar surface. This almost looks Buck Rogers-like in its design, but this is Starship, and NASA has already identified that Artemis 3 and Artemis 4 missions will have Starship as its landing craft to deliver astronauts to the moon. Fingers crossed that the next several flights of Starship are successful. Starship 1, it left the pad and flew for about 2 minutes before it exploded. We'll hope that SpaceX is able to have several successful flights. Again, just to emphasize the cavernous space contained in the Starship. These are multiple levels within Starship here. The other competitor, and NASA must have redundancy. So it has 2 different landers. SpaceX Starship is one of them, and that will certainly be for Artemis 3 and 4, but subsequent missions will have another lander. And this one was recently selected by NASA as a winner. So this will be the other kind of lander that will be used in the Artemis program. And again, notice that the Earth is close to the horizon here, the lunar horizon, and that's because this landing site that's shown here in this artist's rendering is on the South Pole, or near the South Pole of the moon. So why has NASA chosen the moon's South Pole as the location for a permanent base? We've probably heard, I suspect all of you have heard, that India did a spectacular job landing its first robotic lander on the moon on the South Pole about roughly a month ago. They did a superb job, good for India, as having been able to perfect the engineering to soft land a robotic lander on the moon. They did it. The Russians splashed with their Luna 25 mission just a couple of days before. India did it. However, I have to disagree with them on one thing. They've been trumpeting that they landed in the South Pole of the moon. They did not. India was 600 miles from the South Pole of the moon. So close only counts in horseshoes, I guess. 600 miles is not the South Pole. So here we're going to be landing in the south polar regions of the moon. And the reason for that is shown here. Here is a NASA image from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter spacecraft. And the blue regions shown here on the south, this is all the south polar region of the moon here. And just for scale, this crater in the lower right corner here, this very large crater, is about 190 miles across. It's a big crater. All of the blue regions, and that where I'm pointing now in the center of the screen, that blue region right there, that is the lunar South Pole. That's the geographic South Pole of the moon right there where the pointer is. All the blue regions are permanently shadowed. They never see the sunlight. Permanently shadowed regions. Why is that important? The reason it's important is because over billions of years, the moon has had volcanic activity that occasionally releases water vapor from the deep interior of the moon. So volcanic gases seep out of the moon, and those water molecules can, as they migrate or bounce around the moon before they go into interplanetary space, some of them may fall into one of these permanently shadowed regions, and those molecules become trapped. It's so cold in there that the water molecules just stop. Also, when meteorites strike the moon, meteorites have quite a bit of water in them. And when they strike the moon, they release the water. As they slam into the moon, they release the water. And some of those water molecules bounce around the moon before they go into interplanetary space. And some of them find their way into these permanently shadowed regions. So my point is that over billions of years, these permanently shadowed regions, which are astonishingly cold, serve as traps for water. They have been accumulating water for billions of years, and the water has already been detected by robotic spacecraft from India and the United States. Those permanently shadowed regions have water in the form of very cold ice, but there's ice down there. And the quantities of ice in those permanently shadowed regions is still not known with certainty, but the upper level estimates suggest that they could be as much as a Great Lake worth of water. The arrow shown here is the south pole of the moon. So again, this is another region showing, this is another map from NASA. The different colors are different elevations. And the black areas here, so high areas, are shown here in these hot colors. And the purples and blues are elevationally low levels. And areas that are permanently shadowed, such as Shackleton, that I'll show you in the next slide. Shackleton here, 13 miles across. That crater right there is permanently shadowed, 13 miles across. That region is going to be where Artemis 3 will land. This is where we want to land, in this region here, near Shackleton crater, a permanently shadowed crater that is confidently thought to have large resources of water ice. Here is a view, an oblique view showing Earth in the background. This is from an orbiting Japanese spacecraft. Here is Shackleton crater in the foreground here. Earth 250,000 miles away on the horizon. This is the region. Somewhere in this region, NASA will select a landing site, and Artemis 3 will land in this region. Notice that Shackleton is in deep shadow in this image. It is always in deep shadow. It never sees sunlight. Always cold, and for billions of years. So I'm describing this region that you see here as being prime real estate on the moon's south pole. Now, if we know this, the Russians know this, the Chinese know this. That is why all spacefaring nations who are currently looking at the moon as a target for their landers and for human exploration have all targeted the south pole of the moon, because water is going to be a major resource. What else is going to be a major resource? Well, here's a question. What's the most abundant element in moon soil and moon rocks? The answer is, far and away, oxygen. Oxygen is the most abundant element in moon soil and moon rocks, and in the moon in general. The most abundant element in the moon is oxygen. Now, that oxygen is not free oxygen like we are familiar with in the Earth's atmosphere, where we can breathe it. It's not molecular oxygen as a gas. The oxygen that's in and on the moon is tightly bonded to iron and magnesium and calcium and aluminum and silicon. It's tightly bonded, but oxygen is 45 weight percent, nearly half the weight of the entire moon is oxygen. So water is present as an important resource on the South Pole, but also oxygen as well. The habitats that will be constructed here's one artist's rendering of what it might look like. We are going to be establishing permanent bases on the moon where astronauts can stay for months at a time doing research. They will be shielded from solar and galactic cosmic rays by having upwards of 3 to 5 feet of lunar dirt put on top of their habitat to provide a barrier from harmful cosmic rays. In situ resource utilization will also be used. There are contracts currently being funded by NASA to be able to use lunar dirt to make concrete. And here is an artist's rendering of what that will be. We are not going to be hauling up steel girders and all sorts of other things from the Earth to build a space research station on the South Pole of the moon. Much of the materials will be manufactured on the lunar surface. When I said at the very beginning of the talk today that the Artemis program is ambitious, I think you can see that it is ambitious. One of the other things that will need to be fixed is here is an Apollo 17 astronaut during his third moonwalk. And notice that his spacesuit, which started out very white, is no longer white. It is grimy looking. And that is lunar, very fine, micron-sized lunar soil, powder, regolith, that is all over the place. And it is an enemy to health and also the operation of mechanical gears on the moon. So NASA is going to have to figure out how we're going to prevent lunar dust from being a health and mechanical threat to astronauts on the moon. And this is well known, and they're cracking the code on it. Here is what some of that stuff looks like from one of the samples I studied. Here is relatively coarse-grained stuff. This would be each one of these crystals, and here's a glass spheral shown here. Here is some material that is about the size of the width of a human hair. But you can see that it is angular. These are crystals, and these are fragments of glass and crystals that form the dust that is everywhere on the moon. Now that dust comes from pounding, billions of years of pounding of the lunar surface by meteorites slamming into the moon and turning it into powder, like a hammer turns rock into powder. When you hit a rock with a hammer, it just pulverizes it. Well, that's what's happened to the moon for billions of years. Finally, this is an artist's rendition of what the orbiting space station that will be put in orbit around the moon to serve as a way station for astronauts going from the lunar surface to lunar orbit and then back to Earth. This is going to be a way station, an outpost, an orbiting outpost around the moon. So in summary then, the Artemis program is underscoring here, it is ambitious. It is multinational, it is ambitious, and it will be striving for a sustained presence of Americans and many of our spacefaring allies on the moon. It's going to be a collaboration among NASA, SpaceX, and the European Space Agency. The first flights, as you saw, the first test flights of the new rockets, and these are all new rockets, the Space Launch System, brand new, Starship, brand new. They had their inaugural launches in 2022, November 2022, and SpaceX, April 2023. More to come, but we're on a tight timeline. The first Artemis astronauts to land on the moon, the first humans to return to the moon since 1972, will be a woman and a person of color among the crew of 4 that will venture to the moon. Those individuals who will land on the moon, the woman has not been named and the person of color has not yet been named, but that is the goal. Goal is to construct a permanent scientific base or bases on the moon's south pole, the south polar regions, because they have apparently large regions of water ice that can be used not only to make drinkable water, but also hydrogen and oxygen can be separated electrically to make rocket fuel, hydrogen and oxygen. They're going to live off the land using ice and metals in the lunar dirt and rocks. They will mine those resources to make metals, and much of the power that will be needed to do all of that work will be solar. The sun almost never sets on those regions. There are permanently shadowed regions, yes, but the places that are not permanently shadowed are almost permanently in sunlight. The sun never sets in most of those regions of the South Pole. So setting up a large array of solar panels, it's there. Gain experience in developing technology and strategies for sustaining visits to Mars in the 2030s. Complex critical components of the Artemis system are currently under development, such as the human landing system with SpaceX, the other human landing system by another contractor. Spacesuits are being designed so that they can mitigate that dust problem that the Apollo astronauts had. Habitation modules are currently being designed as to what they might look like and how we're going to get them there and assemble them. Equipment for mining the lunar resources under extreme conditions. Contracts have been let by NASA to develop that. Methods for protecting astronauts' health, that's work in progress. And also designs for the Gateway orbiting space station contracts have also already been set for those. There is, as I briefly mentioned, uncertainty about the financial sustainability of NASA's SLS rocket. If it's going to cost $3 to $4 billion per launch, how do you sustain that? Even with only 2 flights per year at $3 to $4 billion per launch, how do you do it? SpaceX is going to have no problem. If SpaceX is successful, here is the cost differential between the Space Launch System and NASA. NASA's Space Launch System and SpaceX. NASA's SLS, $3 to $4 billion per launch. How much per launch for the Starship, SpaceX Starship? 10 million. $3 billion per launch versus 10 million per launch. One is with a B and the other is with an M. Wow, what a cost difference. Which one is sustainable? And finally, the presence of lunar resources, especially water, for rocket fuel and also for sustaining human life. The presence of lunar resources, especially water, is essential for the success of Artemis. If we have, I won't say it that way. Let's hope that our current measurements of the lunar surface from orbit, looking down on those permanently shadowed regions, that the data returned remotely from those regions are correct in estimating that there is a large quantity of water in those permanently shadowed regions. There better be. We're betting on it. We're confident that that is the case, but it's essential that large quantities of water be extractable from those permanently shadowed regions. Thank you very much.
And thank you, John. Fascinating. If you could unshare your slides so that we can see everybody.
Yes.
Great. And we'll open this up to questions. Susan, can you unmute yourself?
I am so sorry. This was one of the most exciting things I've heard in a long time, and I have to peel off for a music festival board meeting right now. But John, thank you very, very much. I'd love to be sure that we extend this to lots and lots of younger people, especially who are in school right now. I think it would be immensely exciting for them. So thanks, and can't wait for the next one. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Susan. And this is a source of inspiration. It can be a source of epiphanies, as Sputnik was for me as a little kid back in 1957. This can be a great motivator for kids to aim high.
Exactly. I had the great privilege of being at the second to last Apollo launch, and I thought your description of the last one was exactly right. It was just what I experienced. It was just sensational. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Susan. I'm glad that you've also experienced the thrill of these enormous launches.
It's just splendid. I can't wait for your next talk. Come back.
Thank you.
Okay.
We have a question in the chat feature, and it's, what is the timing of this venture?
Yeah, the timing of the venture is the Artemis 2 mission with that crew of 4, 1 Canadian and 3 American veteran astronauts, is due to currently launch in November of 2024. So about 1 year from now is the next Artemis launch. Artemis 3, the first landing on the moon, is currently estimated to be late 2026. That depends, of course, on a successful flight of Artemis 2, and also SpaceX having multiple successes with their space launch, with their Starship. Not only multiple launches, but also being able to demonstrate that they can refuel multiple times in Earth orbit, so they can then send a fully fueled Starship to the moon. They have to be able to demonstrate a number of things between now and late 2026 before Artemis 3 will fly and bring American astronauts to the lunar surface.
We have.
Yeah.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, okay. I don't know how to raise my hand. Excellent presentation. My question is, if we're so unclear on what's inside this Shackleton crater, why don't we send a robot first and analyze the soil or the ice or whatever's there before we take chances there?
A very good question, John, and that will happen next year. NASA has already identified the contractor, the launch facility, the launch rocket. Money has been spent building that automated rover, which will go into one of those permanently shadowed regions next year to scope out that exact point. You're absolutely right. There are also orbiting robotic spacecraft now, which are using instruments to look down using neutron spectrometers to determine whether there is water on the surface. Data suggests that there is, but being able to get a rover on the surface, scratch the dirt, and have chemical analysis of the dirt and demonstrate, as you say, that there is several percent water buried a foot below the surface will be very important. Yes.
Yeah.
So you may have touched on this, but what evidence do we have for the presence of water ice?
Yeah, the presence of water ice is based on robotic instruments, orbiters, from India and also the United States have looked down with special instruments, particularly what are called neutron spectrometers, in a way that would be difficult to explain with just my arm waving here. But the energy of neutrons coming off the surface of the moon can indicate the presence of water. And those neutrons say there is quite a bit of water down there in those permanently shadowed regions. There are other attempts to see if we can get other kinds of spectrometers to look into those permanently shadowed regions to see, again, gain greater confidence that there's as much water down there as we think. But it's a tough, permanently shadowed means that it's permanently dark, and it's difficult to get information from permanently dark areas to your spacecraft. But actually, it's being done.
I have a comment. Dave says that he's having trouble wrapping his head around the 1,000 times differential between the two launch rockets.
So is everyone else, Dave. The SpaceX is based on sound engineers and scientists who decided that they wanted to do something way out of the box, think way outside the box in terms of sustainable launch capabilities, in which being able to launch something a couple of times a day is sustainable because you can reuse the spacecraft dozens, if not 100 times. It is, I'll use an analogy here. Imagine how much an airline ticket would cost if we wanted to fly from New York to Los Angeles on a 747 that would be used once. They would bring it to JFK, you would fly it to LA, and that would be the only flight that the 747 would ever make. What would be the price of a ticket? Well, of course, you have the cost of a 747 that you're only going to use once. My gosh, how do you can see that our price of a flight ticket would be ginormous. The fact that airplanes can last for 30 or 40 years doing multiple flights is what makes air travel affordable. Well, that was what SpaceX said. Well, if you want to make space flight affordable, you've got to be able to use things multiple times. And they've done. Congress, on the other hand, 10 years ago said, we want NASA to build a new kind of rocket that will be able to take human beings beyond Earth orbit. We are fed up with only hanging around low Earth orbit. We've done that for 50 years. Nope. NASA, give up the space shuttle. The space shuttle is only capable of low Earth orbit. Give it up and go for major new adventures. However, what you will do is you will use legacy technology from the space shuttle. Oh. And then what? Well, you're only going to get a certain amount of money to do this. How much? Well, that's not enough money to do it. Well, that's what you're going to get. So to give you an illustration of it, the engines, the liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen engines on the Space Launch System are exquisite. They are exquisite engineering marvels from the space shuttle. They were used upwards of 30 times, 30 different flights of the space shuttle used the same engines. That's how good they were. They were reusable. And you say, well, okay, well, what's happening now? We're using the same engines that are now being rebuilt. New ones are being built. And what's happening to them on the Space Launch System? They are highly reliable. They are exquisite pieces of engineering. We know that they work like a champ. So what we do is we put 4 of them on the core stage of the booster of the SLS, and we launch it and we throw it in the ocean. I know, but those are reusable engines. Well, yeah, I know, but they're not being reused. They're highly reliable, extremely expensive, and we use them once. The cost goes through the roof. That's what Congress wanted. That's what we got. SpaceX did not have that kind of constraint. They said, here we go. We're going to blow the doors off with this new technology and with different goals. We're not going to have to deal with those constraints. That in part, I hope, addresses your question, Dave. A factor of 1,000 difference in launch costs.
We have another question. Why is there such a large difference in cost between SpaceX and NASA?
Yes, again, Congress has contributed to the restricting NASA to certain guidelines of technological development. SpaceX did not have those constraints and could think outside the box, and also at the same time be getting billions of dollars of funding from NASA to encourage their technological innovations.
Okay.
The Space Launch System is extremely reliable. The Space Launch System is expected to be an extremely reliable launch vehicle. NASA said, and Congress said, you better make it reliable. You're going to put people on board. You better make it reliable. Okay. That's why we use those exquisite space shuttle engines and use them only once. The cost goes through the roof. SpaceX, on the other hand, tried that launch in April. Well, it got off the pad, blew the pad apart, got up, had two minutes of flight before it destroyed itself. But SpaceX says, oh, well, we learned something. We'll try something different next time. Congress would be going Meshuggah.
Another question, how deep is the Shackleton crater?
Now, the Shackleton crater currently, the ratio is usually about roughly 10-to-1 diameter to depth ratio. So the diameter is 13 miles. So the depth of the Shackleton crater is about 1.5 miles.
Let's see. Part of their rationale for the moon base is to prepare for a trip to Mars, but won't a Mars trip be launched from Earth's orbit?
Yeah, interesting question. It's not clear where a Mars mission is going to launch from, but current suggestions are that if Artemis is successful in producing effectively a modest industry on the south pole of the moon with metals and rocket fuel, hydrogen and oxygen, that a spacecraft may be built on the Earth assembled in different pieces in lunar orbit, fueled in lunar orbit, and blast off from lunar orbit to get to Mars.
Oh, okay.
But the architecture of a Mars flight is still, as you can imagine, still being evaluated. But that's one of the scenarios.
How many astronauts will be on the moon?
Yeah, the crew which will go first will be a three-person crew is currently being suggested, a 3-person crew for the Artemis 3 landing. There will be other crew members, at least one crew member left in lunar orbit to rendezvous, left in lunar orbit in the Orion spacecraft to later be rendezvoused with by the returning Starship. Crew will be transferred from the Starship after that has left the moon. That crew will be transferred to the Artemis Orion spacecraft, and the Orion returns to Earth.
Another question. Solar power seems limited. Any consideration of small modular reactors?
Yes, yes. Solar will definitely be a major ingredient for generating electricity on the moon, since most of the area of the south pole of the moon is about 90% of the time. 90% of the time is you can find places, mountainous regions in the south pole of the moon that are almost in permanent sunlight. So that'll be the way to start. But when you really gear up for a lot of needed power, modular nuclear is also being recommended as another source, another major source of power when and if this large settlement gets going.
Dave says at the first lecture I heard you give, you said that we should obtain evidence of extraterrestrial life in my lifetime. Do you remain optimistic that that will happen?
What a great question. Thank you, Dave. Thank you. What happened about three weeks ago? And I am not clairvoyant. But around 3 weeks ago, the James Webb Space Telescope announced, through a peer-reviewed publication, announced the apparent detection of dimethyl sulfide, the molecule dimethyl sulfide, in the atmosphere of an exoplanet. Why is that important? Dimethyl sulfide is because we know how dimethyl sulfide is produced on Earth. It is produced by marine organisms. Marine organisms is the only source. The only source of dimethyl sulfide on Earth is, except in chemistry labs, but the only source of dimethyl sulfide in the Earth's atmosphere is from marine microorganisms. And dimethyl sulfide appears to have been detected on an ocean world about 200 light years from Earth. It is known with confidence to be an ocean world, ocean-covered world, a little bit bigger than Earth. And by golly, dimethyl sulfide has been found in that atmosphere. Holy mackerel. If that is verified with subsequent spectral measurements by the James Webb Space Telescope, ta-da!
Exciting.
3 weeks ago, Dave, we're going to keep our ears to the scientific literature and to TV news to see whether that is verified. But it's it could be a real game changer. Now, that isn't intelligent life, that's microbial life, but nonetheless, it's a start. The next thing is to look for what are known as technosignatures. Technosignatures. That's a biosignature. But what about some molecules are biosignatures? Dimethyl sulfide is a biosignature. It's something that signifies the presence of life. The next thing is to look for technosignatures, and that is looking for industrial pollution in the atmospheres of other worlds. That'll be a headline.
Dave says, that's wonderful. Does that water planet have a name?
Yes, it does, but it is a NASA-like name, K2-18b. It kind of rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? K2-18b, I think, is the name of the name of the planet. It has not been given a name that beyond the anatomy of its discovery. It has not been given a name. I think it's K2-18b.
And I don't see any other questions. Last chance. Oh, couldn't there be life on planets in our solar system?
Yes, there could be life on planets in our solar system. Specifically, Mars, of course, is being considered to be one of the potential sources. There are two other sources that have emerged in the last 10 years or so, based on NASA spacecraft, that have indicated something very special, and that is a moon of Jupiter, Europa, is now known with very high confidence to have a layer of, it's about the size of the Earth's moon, has a layer of ice, a global layer of ice, somewhere currently estimated to be 5 to 10 miles thick, on top of an ocean of salt water, possibly 200 miles deep. 200 miles of ocean below a 5 to 10 mile thick layer of ice. And that ocean is thought to be a potential habitat of microbial life. Another similar habitat is found around a satellite of a moon of Saturn, a smaller moon called Enceladus. And the NASA's Cassini spacecraft, now that Enceladus is neat on mosquito because it is smaller moon, but it had geysers shooting out from its ice-covered surface. It had geysers shooting about 100 miles out above the surface. And NASA said, let's fly through those geysers and let's turn our instruments on as we steer our spacecraft through this plume of water vapor coming out of the interior of Enceladus, and they detected organic molecules. So Enceladus may also be a habitat for microbial life on Earth. So Mars, Europa, and Enceladus are three habitats, potential habitats for microbial life in our own solar system. Yet to be determined, but NASA has the Europa mission already on the books, being built, and will soon, I think next year, will launch to Europa to begin to give us more detail on the potential for life beneath the ice cap. of Europa.
Okay, well, this is all very fascinating and exciting. I want to thank you again, John, for being with us here. We look forward to having you back.
Thank you.
And I want to thank everyone for joining us. So enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody. Great to see you.